Fierce, hungry, fighting dog finds abandoned helpless baby. What he did next to the baby will make you cry. Let's begin the story. The forest at night was a world of its own, an unsettling blend of serenity and foreboding. The dense canopy of ancient trees stretched high above, blocking out most of the moonlight and leaving the forest floor cloaked in darkness. Among the shadows, Rex, the scarred and battle-worn fighting dog, lay still. His massive frame was hidden beneath a rotting log, the perfect shelter from the night's chill. Yet tonight, as he lay beneath the log, his ears perked up. There was something different in the air, something that broke the usual stillness of the forest. It wasn't the cry of an animal. It was human, a baby, fragile and alone in the vast wilderness. Rex let out a low growl, his instincts at war with his training. For a moment he considered ignoring it. He could turn away, retreat into the shadows. Rex rose to his feet. His movements were slow, deliberate, as he made his way toward the source of the cry. He moved cautiously, every step calculated, his senses on high alert. His nostrils flared, trying to catch the scent that might lead him to the baby. The forest around him was thick with underbrush, the ground uneven and treacherous. But Rex navigated it with ease. He had lived here for years and he knew every twist and turn of the path. His paws made no sound as he moved through the trees, his large frame gliding effortlessly through the darkness. The baby's cry grew louder, more urgent. The sound echoed through the forest, piercing the night air, and Rex felt his heart quicken. What kind of world was this, where a baby was left alone in the woods? Rex didn't understand it. He didn't care about the cruelty of humans. He had seen enough of that. But this was different. The baby was helpless, vulnerable. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't an enemy. It was a life in need. As Rex pushed through a thick bush, he came to a clearing. His eyes scanned the area, and that's when he saw it. At the edge of the road, just beyond the tree line, lay a small bundle wrapped in a tattered blanket. The baby's cries were weaker now, but still desperate, still full of fear. Rex stepped closer, his body tense, every muscle coiled as he neared the helpless child. The baby was tiny, its fragile form barely visible in the dim light. Its face was flushed from crying, its tiny hands flailing weakly in the air. The blanket that wrapped it was old and torn, barely providing any warmth or protection. The sight of it sent a surge of something Rex couldn't name, a strange, unfamiliar feeling he hadn't experienced in years. The baby's wide eyes locked onto his, filled with terror and confusion. Rex took a step back, unsure of what to do. He was a fighter, a survivor. But this was a life he couldn't fight or flee from. He wasn't sure how to help, how to comfort, or even if he should. His instincts screamed at him to walk away, to leave the baby to its fate. But something inside him tugged at him, something deep and primal that wouldn't let him turn away. The baby's cries grew softer, as if the little one sensed the presence of the dog. Its small body shivered in the cold air, and Rex could hear its ragged breathing. He hesitated for a moment longer before taking a cautious step forward. Gently, he nudged the bundle with his nose, his instincts taking over. The fabric shifted, and Rex found himself face to face with the baby's tiny, vulnerable face. For a long moment, neither the dog nor the baby moved. The world around them seemed to hold its breath. Rex could feel the warmth of the baby's skin against his cold nose, and he could hear the steady beat of its tiny heart. It was alive, fragile, and utterly alone. In that moment, Rex understood something he had never known before, a deep, protective urge that surged through him. The baby's wide eyes stared up at him, and for a brief instant, the two of them shared a silent connection. The baby, small and fragile, seemed to recognize that Rex was not a threat. In the darkness of the forest, with danger lurking around every corner, the baby reached out a tiny hand, trembling, toward the dog. Rex's heart skipped a beat. He felt something inside him shift, something he hadn't felt in years. It was a feeling of warmth, of care, of responsibility. Without thinking, he gently nudged the baby closer to his side, curling his massive body around the tiny form. His fur, coarse and rough, shielded the baby from the cold night air, and he let out a soft, low growl, an instinctual sound meant to comfort, to protect. The baby's cries had stopped, replaced by quiet, shallow breaths. As the baby settled into an uneasy sleep, Rex kept watch, his sharp eyes scanning the surrounding forest, every sense on high alert. He didn't understand it, but he knew one thing for certain. He would not let anything harm this fragile life. As the night wore on, Rex lay beside the baby, his body still in alert. The forest around them was silent, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the wind and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the child. For the first time in a long time, Rex felt something other than the familiar weight of loneliness. He felt a sense of purpose, a drive to protect, to keep the baby safe no matter what. The world had given up on him. It had discarded him like a broken tool, left him to wander the wilderness alone. But in that moment, as the baby slept peacefully beside him, Rex realized that perhaps he wasn't as broken as he thought. Perhaps in the end, he still had something to offer. The forest was still, the night was long, and Rex, the battle-hardened dog, had found something worth fighting for. The cold night air was sharp and biting as Rex carefully nestled beside the small bundle, his large muscular frame providing warmth to the fragile child. The baby, wrapped in an old tattered blanket, had quieted down. Its tiny chest rose and fell in the rhythmic rise and fall of breath. But Rex could hear the faint tremble of distress beneath the calm. His ears pricked at every little sound, and his large dark eyes scanned the surrounding forest for any sign of danger. There was a constant tension in his body, a subtle unease that had been there ever since he first heard the baby's cries. The night felt different now. For years, Rex had lived in isolation, hunting, surviving, avoiding human settlements and other dogs, and seeking shelter where he could. He had been a fierce fighting dog, raised in the pits where strength meant everything, where weakness was punished. His life had been a series of cold, calculated actions designed to keep him alive in an unforgiving world. No one had ever needed him before, but now with the baby in his care, things had changed. The faint rustle of the leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, and the occasional snap of a twig under the weight of a prowling animal were all sounds Rex was accustomed to. They didn't faze him. What troubled him now, however, was the gentle, helpless whimper coming from the baby. Every time it stirred, Rex's heart ached in a way he could not explain. There was something about the softness of this tiny creature that made everything inside him ache with a tenderness he never thought he could feel. His ears swiveled again as the baby gave a soft cry, its hands reaching out instinctively, as if searching for something, someone. Rex felt a sharp pang in his chest as he watched the baby's tiny fingers grasping at the air, unable to find what it needed. His body tensed and he instinctively nudged the baby closer to him, curling his massive frame around it. The baby's cries softened the moment it was in Rex's warmth. The change was subtle, but Rex could feel the shift. The child's tiny body no longer trembled as violently, and its cries turned to soft, hiccuping breaths. Rex gently nudged the child with his nose, his snout brushing against its tiny face. The baby's eyes fluttered open, revealing large, dark pupils that seemed to stare directly into Rex's soul. The gaze was filled with confusion and fear, emotions Rex knew all too well, but it also held a kind of trust, a fragile hope that made something inside Rex stir in an unfamiliar way. The moment stretched on as the baby's tiny hand reached out to Rex's face. Rex held his breath, unsure of what to do. His body was so used to violence, to fighting back, to being alone. But here, in the presence of this child, something new awakened within him. Slowly, Rex lowered his head, his massive form towering over the baby, as he allowed the small hand to make contact with his fur. The baby's fingers brushed against his coat, and for a moment, everything else ceased to matter. A sharp wind blew through the trees, making Rex's fur ruffle slightly. The air was growing colder, and the night seemed endless. Yet Rex did not want to leave the safety of the hollow tree. He had no real understanding of what was happening, only that it felt right to be here, to stay with this helpless child. He shifted, curling his body around the baby more protectively, his chest pressed up against the infant, providing warmth, while his eyes remained vigilant, constantly scanning the darkened forest. For years, Rex had been alone. There had been no companionship, no sense of belonging. But now, as he lay beside the child, he realized that this was a new kind of bond, one that he could not name, but one that filled him with an undeniable sense of purpose. His purpose had always been survival, his own survival. But this was different. Now his purpose was to protect. He was needed. For the first time in his life, someone relied on him for their safety, for their well-being. Rex's ears perked again as the soft cry of a distant animal reached his ears. A low growl escaped his throat, a primal instinct that he could not silence. He needed to protect the baby. The rest of the forest could wait. Rex's keen senses identified the approaching threat before it even came into view. A figure slinked through the underbrush, a coyote drawn by the scent of the baby. Rex's body tensed, his muscles coiled, ready for the fight. He rose silently, stepping away from the baby, but keeping himself between the child and the approaching predator. The coyote stopped at the edge of the clearing, its sharp eyes narrowing in on the sight of the dog. Rex's teeth glinted in the moonlight, his low growl sending a clear message. The coyote hesitated for a moment, eyeing Rex warily. It was hungry, but it was not foolish. Rex was a formidable opponent, a creature forged for battle. Rex's teeth glinted in the moonlight, his low growl sending a clear message. The coyote hesitated for a moment, eyeing Rex warily. It was hungry, but it was not foolish. Rex was a formidable opponent, a creature forged for battle, and tonight, Rex was not going to let anything harm the baby. The standoff lasted for what felt like an eternity, the silence thick in the air. Then, with a flick of its tail, the coyote decided that it would not challenge the larger dog. It slunk back into the shadows, disappearing into the darkness. Rex remained still for several moments, his heart pounding in his chest, his eyes never leaving the spot where the coyote had been. He wanted to run after it, to chase it down, to remind it that this was his territory. But then he looked down at the baby, still nestled in the hollow tree. The small, trusting eyes that stared up at him seemed to calm the fire in his chest. It was strange. For so many years, Rex had been taught that survival meant fighting, that it meant taking what you needed, whether by force or by cunning. But with the baby, there was something else, something softer, something that spoke of gentleness and care. A shift deep inside him was happening without him fully realizing it. And though he didn't understand it, he knew that the baby needed him now. It was his responsibility, his to protect. The night dragged on, hours slipping by like minutes. Rex stayed on high alert, ever watchful, never allowing himself to relax fully. His sharp ears and nose constantly searched the night for any sign of danger. His body coiled like a spring, ready to act at a moment's notice. The baby slept fitfully, its tiny body shifting every now and then, its hands reaching out for comfort. Rex instinctively responded, leaning down to nuzzle the baby with his snout, offering reassurance. In return, the baby's small fingers clutched the edges of his fur, drawing closer to him in a way that spoke of trust and dependency. As dawn's first light began to creep through the trees, painting the forest in soft hues of gold and pink, Rex allowed himself a brief moment of rest. The danger had passed for now, and the baby had settled into a peaceful slumber, its breathing steady and calm. Rex, his eyes half closed in exhaustion, stretched his aching limbs, his body sore from the constant vigilance. The bond that had formed between them during the long hours of the night was undeniable. Rex had always been a dog of action, quick, fierce, and focused. But now, with the baby by his side, he was learning a different kind of strength. The strength to be gentle, to protect without violence, to be something other than the killer he had been trained to be. The night had tested him, had shown him what he was capable of. And now, as he lay beside the baby, Rex understood one thing with complete certainty. He would protect this child. No matter the cost, no matter the danger, he would not let harm come to it. For the first time in his life, he had found a reason to fight for something more than himself. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting light on the forest around them, Rex looked out into the distance. The world was vast, and unknown dangers lurked everywhere. But for the first time in his life, Rex felt that he was ready to face whatever came his way. Not as a lone, discarded fighter, but as a protector, standing strong for the life of the tiny, helpless creature who had changed everything. The forest was a world all its own, an eternal dance of shadows and silence. For Rex, every leaf, every rustle, every crack in the earth held meaning. His senses were finely tuned to the rhythm of nature, the faintest shift in the wind, the distant sound of hooves on the ground, the chirp of a lone bird. These were the things that kept him alive, the things that defined his existence in the wild. But tonight, his focus was different. It was no longer on the forest, no longer on the animal tracks or the distant sounds of his prey. It was on the small life beside him, lying in the soft, thick blanket he had carefully fashioned. The baby, the thing that had irrevocably changed his life. The soft, rhythmic breathing of the child was the only thing that grounded Rex as the hours passed. He couldn't sleep, not fully. How could he, knowing that something so fragile, so helpless depended on him? The tiny human, so different from anything he had known, so vulnerable, stirred in his makeshift nest, wrapping its tiny fingers around the fur of his side. Rex's heart, which had long been hardened by years of survival in the unforgiving wild, softened in response. It was an emotion he had not expected, nor had he ever allowed himself to feel so deeply. He shifted closer to the baby, his large protective body curling around the small form. His warm breath was steady, each exhale carrying a comforting promise. The baby was safe, for now. That was all that mattered. The bond that had slowly formed between them was unspoken, yet it was undeniable. As the wind began to pick up, stirring the trees and causing the branches to creak under its weight, Rex's ears flicked toward a distant sound. His instincts kicked in, scanning the perimeter. A low growl rumbled in his throat, not of aggression, but of alertness. His senses sharpened. Something was out there. The night felt different tonight. There was something ominous about the silence, a heaviness that he could not ignore. The baby stirred again, its tiny face scrunching up in a sign of discomfort. Rex instinctively nudged it closer, his warm nose gently brushing against the child's skin in an attempt to soothe. It worked. The baby quieted, but Rex's mind remained on alert. He wasn't just protecting the baby from physical harm. There were other dangers in the world. Dangers far more insidious than the sharp teeth of wild predators or the claws of a lurking beast. Suddenly, a faint rustle in the bushes caught his attention. Rex's muscles tensed, his hackles raised. His gaze darted toward the sound, his eyes narrowing. A figure emerged from the shadows, stepping cautiously toward the clearing. At first, Rex thought it was an animal, but as the figure stepped further into the dim light, he saw that it was a man, a human, dirty and worn, his face gaunt and eyes wide with hunger. The man froze upon seeing Rex, his eyes flicking to the baby and then back to the dog. His body language was a mix of desperation and fear. Rex stood tall, his posture defensive, his eyes fixed on the stranger. He could feel the danger that came with this encounter. There was no mistaking the hunger in the man's eyes, but it wasn't just for food, it was something darker. The man opened his mouth as if to speak, but the words didn't come right away. Instead, he shuffled forward a few steps, his hands raised in a gesture of peace, though his eyes betrayed him. Rex's growl deepened, a warning that vibrated through the air. "I don't want any trouble," the man muttered, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. "I've been lost for days, just need food. Just need a little help." His gaze flicked again to the baby, and Rex's instincts flared. His body stiffened, every muscle coiled with a readiness to spring into action. The man took another step forward, and Rex's teeth flashed, the low growl turning into a more pronounced snarl. The man froze, sensing the change in the air. He swallowed hard, trying to keep his fear from overtaking him. "I won't hurt the child," he said, his voice breaking. "I swear. I just need something to eat." Rex didn't lower his stance. His eyes never left the man. He had seen too much in his years to trust such desperate pleas. The man was weak, starving, but there was something in his eyes, something that made Rex's blood run cold. It wasn't just hunger. There was a flicker of something darker in the man's gaze. The baby was vulnerable, defenseless. It was all too easy for someone with a twisted mind to see that as an opportunity. The baby began to whimper, restless in its sleep. Rex's heart constricted, his protective instincts surging. Without thinking, he stepped forward, positioning himself firmly between the stranger and the child, his body a solid barrier. The growl deepened in his throat, a warning that left no room for doubt. "I'll leave," the man said quickly, his hands raised again in surrender. "Just, please, I won't come back." Rex didn't let up. He could feel the man's eyes lingering on the baby, the temptation there. But the man knew better than to test the dog's resolve. Slowly, reluctantly, the man turned and stumbled off into the darkness, leaving Rex standing vigilant, his body tense. The man's departure didn't bring Rex peace. His instincts were still on edge, the lingering presence of danger still hanging in the air. He returned to his position by the baby, curling himself around it once more. The baby, its tiny body now pressed against his side, had stopped whimpering. It felt safe. For now, Rex thought. But something else had shifted inside of him. He couldn't ignore it. The instinct to protect was no longer just a reflex. It was a need, a consuming force that had overtaken his thoughts. The baby wasn't just a helpless creature to care for. It was his responsibility now, and that bond was growing stronger with every passing moment. In the days that followed, Rex became even more attuned to the baby's needs. He watched it with the intensity of a mother protecting her child. Each time the baby cried, Rex's heart would race. When the baby would reach out with tiny, curious hands, Rex would meet the touch with the gentleness of a father. Each passing day deepened their bond, each moment together, a reminder of the responsibility that had been thrust upon him. But Rex also knew that this fragile bond could be shattered at any moment. The world was a dangerous place. He had seen it before, time and time again. There was no such thing as safety, not for him, not for the baby. And yet, as the baby slept beside him, a sense of resolve settled over Rex. He would do whatever it took to protect this tiny life. He was no longer a lone wolf in the wild. He was something else now, a protector, a guardian. The days passed slowly. Rex's attention was divided between the baby and the forest. He hunted for food, always returning to the child, always checking that it was safe. Every evening he would settle beside it, his body curled around the small form, his senses alert for any sign of danger. The forest felt different now, less like a home and more like a battlefield. Every sound, every shift in the wind was a reminder that the world outside their small camp was unforgiving. But inside the small circle of safety that Rex had created for them, the bond between him and the baby grew. And though Rex could not fully understand the depth of the emotions he was experiencing, he knew one thing for sure. He would never let anything harm the child, no matter what. The forest had changed. Rex could feel it in the air. What had once been a place of peace was now charged with an unsettling tension, as if the trees themselves whispered in warning. The sounds of nature, the familiar rustling of leaves and calls of distant birds, felt like distant memories now. In their place was a heavy silence, as though something was waiting, watching, lurking in the shadows just beyond his sight. For days, Rex had been on edge. It wasn't just the usual hunger or fear of predators. It was something deeper, something primal that clawed at his instincts. His sharp, vigilant eyes scanned the edges of their small camp every night, and his ears twitched at every breeze. The baby, ever oblivious, slept soundly beside him. Rex's loyalty to the child was absolute. The tiny being, so fragile and innocent, was his only concern. Everything else, every other threat, could wait. But that night the quiet was different. The usual hum of the forest had faded into an eerie stillness, and Rex's every sense screamed at him that danger was near. The baby stirred in its sleep, and Rex's heart skipped a beat. He knew what that meant, the calm before the storm. He had to act. Rex rose to his feet, his muscles coiling. He stood still for a moment, his breath slow and controlled. The moonlight shone down, casting long shadows across the ground, and Rex's golden eyes gleamed in the dark. His ears perked, straining to catch the slightest sound. A low rustling. He felt it. Someone was out there. But who? And why now? The familiar smell of humans reached his nose, though faint. It was a smell he had learned to fear. the stench of people desperate for survival, the kind who would do anything to stay alive. Rex's gut tightened. His body was poised, his instincts sharpened like never before. He had learned the hard way that people could be unpredictable, dangerous, especially when they were hungry or desperate, and these strangers, whoever they were clearly both. Rex's growl was low but menacing, rumbling deep from within his chest. It was a warning, a clear signal to whoever was out there that he would not tolerate any intrusion. His eyes flashed to the baby, who still slept peacefully, unaware of the danger creeping ever closer. The shadows moved, one figure, then another. He could see them now, two people, stumbling through the underbrush, their bodies tense, their eyes darting around nervously. "Stay back," Rex growled, his voice low and warning. The first figure, a man, froze at the sound, his wide eyes meeting Rex's with a mix of fear and desperation. His hand was raised in the air, an offering of peace, though Rex could smell the fear, the sweat that clung to him. "We don't want trouble," the man said in a trembling voice, his words hushed but urgent. "We're just lost. We need help. Please." Rex's eyes narrowed. He didn't trust the man's words. Desperation was a dangerous thing. It twisted the mind, made people do terrible things. The second figure, a woman, stepped forward slowly, her hand brushing the side of her face. She was thin, gaunt with hunger, her skin pale, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. Rex's nostrils flared as he smelled her, a scent of fear, but underneath, a quiet determination. She wasn't here by choice. They were both survivors, just like him. But that didn't matter. The baby was his responsibility. The stakes were higher now. This wasn't just about survival. It was about the child, the one thing Rex swore to protect with his life. The man spoke again. His voice cracked. "Please, we don't want any trouble. We're just looking for shelter. Food." Rex stepped forward, growling louder now, warning them. His teeth flashed, his body low to the ground. His instincts screamed at him to attack, to drive them away, to do whatever it took to keep the baby safe. But the woman, the second figure, stepped forward with more courage than Rex expected. She raised her hand slowly, trying to calm him. "We don't want to hurt you. We just need help. Please." Rex's eyes flicked to the baby again, the child still asleep, unaware. His protective instincts were in overdrive, but his mind raced. If these strangers were truly desperate, maybe they weren't a threat. But if they were lying, if they intended harm, there would be no second chances. For a moment, time stood still. Rex's growl became a deep rumble, vibrating through the forest, a clear message. "Leave, or face the consequences." The man hesitated, looking at his companion before lowering his hands. "We're not dangerous. We won't harm you. We're just trying to survive." Rex remained frozen, unsure. Trust had to be earned, not given. His heart pounded as he considered their words. They had no weapons, no visible threats. But that didn't mean they weren't dangerous. Rex's eyes locked with the woman's. There was something in her gaze, something honest, something that made him hesitate. It wasn't the fear of someone trying to deceive him. It was a look of someone pushed to the brink of despair. She was human, like him, fighting to survive. His body remained taut, ready to spring into action at the slightest provocation. But the baby shifted, and Rex's heart softened for a brief moment. The child, his charge, was safe. For now. Rex backed off a step, his eyes never leaving the strangers. He had given them a chance, a fleeting moment, but it wasn't enough. His instinct to protect was all-consuming, and he could not trust them. The man stepped forward, his voice trembling. We won't stay long. We'll leave after we rest for a bit." Rex growled again, louder this time, showing his teeth. This was his territory, and he would not share it with anyone. He wouldn't allow these people to put the baby at risk. But the woman, stepping forward with surprising calm, spoke again. "We don't want trouble. We have nowhere else to go. Please help us." Rex's pulse quickened. The weight of their words hung in the air, and in that brief moment, he realized something he had been avoiding. They were like him. They had nowhere else to turn. Survival, at any cost. But the baby. Rex's gaze fell on the child again. The baby had to come first. It always had to come first. Suddenly, a new noise reached his ears. The unmistakable sound of other figures approaching. More people. The man's eyes widened in panic. "We've got to go. Now!" Rex's muscles tensed as he heard the sound of footsteps getting closer. Not just two more figures, but more. The forest was closing in on them, the weight of the night pressing down harder, making every decision feel like it could be the last one. He looked between the strangers and the approaching figures. There was no time for hesitation. If he didn't act now, they'd be surrounded. With a sudden burst of movement, Rex lunged forward, barking sharply. He had to move fast. His plan was simple: scare them off before they could make any moves toward the baby. But as his growl turned into a vicious bark, the man and woman flinched, their faces filled with fear. "Please, stop! We just—" The woman's voice was drowned out by the roar of Rex's barking. Rex's heart raced. They needed to leave. But now they weren't just dealing with the strangers. Another threat was looming. And this time, there might be no escape. In the distance, Rex saw them, shadowy figures emerging from the woods just beyond the trees. There were more than he expected, 4 of them moving fast, their eyes flashing in the moonlight. They were armed, not with guns but with weapons, knives, clubs, things Rex had learned to fear. The strangers, for all their desperation, were not alone. Rex growled low again, his gaze flicking between the approaching danger and the baby. He had made his decision. He had to protect the child, whatever it took, whatever the cost. But it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about honor, loyalty, and love in its purest form. With the baby still safe by his side, Rex moved. This time there would be no hesitation. There would be no mercy. Rex had never known a peace as fragile as the one that hung in the air tonight. The forest around him, which had once felt like an endless maze of comforting shadows, now felt like an enemy closing in on him from all sides. The crisp night air felt heavier than usual, thick with the scent of damp earth and impending danger. Every rustling leaf, every snap of a twig, seemed amplified in the silence. The baby, still wrapped in the threadbare blanket Rex had found days ago, slept restlessly by his side. He could feel the weight of its tiny presence, its warmth against his chest, a constant reminder of the promise he'd made. Protect, keep safe. And yet, despite his heightened awareness, despite every inch of his body being tuned to the environment, he couldn't shake the feeling that something, someone, was watching. He was no longer alone. Rex's breath was shallow, nostrils flaring as he scanned the forest, his senses on high alert. The baby's soft breathing contrasted with the pounding of his own heart, which drummed in his chest, each beat a countdown. The strangers, the ones who had come so close to taking the baby, were still fresh in his mind. The woman's voice had held a tinge of desperation, a plea for mercy that Rex had almost granted. Almost. But something in the man's eyes had made him hesitate. Something dark. Rex's past had taught him to trust no one, not even the ones who seemed like they were in need. He had learned that the hard way, time and time again. Trust was a luxury that no one could afford when survival was at stake. And as the cool night air settled around him, Rex realized that trust was no longer something he could afford either. That burned with a mixture of fear and determination. He looked like a man pushed to the edge. "We don't want any trouble," the man said, his voice hoarse, as if the very words had been dragged from deep inside him. His eyes darted nervously from Rex to the baby. "We've got nothing left. No food, no shelter. Please, we just need a place to rest. Please, just give us a chance." Rex didn't move. His muscles were like iron. His growl deepened, sending vibrations through the air, thick with warning. The man hesitated, his hand twitching toward his side, where Rex could see the outline of a knife sheathed in a ragged pouch. Rex's gaze never wavered. The man seemed to understand that he wasn't in control of the situation anymore. There were no negotiations, no pleading. Rex had learned long ago that the only way to survive was to be prepared for anything, even if it meant making difficult choices. But before Rex could act, the woman emerged from behind him, her eyes wide with terror. She was shaking, her clothes torn and blood-stained. Her gaze met Rex's, and for the first time, he saw the desperation in her eyes. She wasn't like the man. She didn't have the same hunger for power. She was scared, just like him. "Please," she whispered, stepping closer. "We don't want to hurt you or the baby. We just need help. We've lost so much already. Please." Her voice broke on the last word, and Rex's heart twitched with something he couldn't name. It wasn't pity, it was understanding. But that moment of vulnerability only lasted a fraction of a second. The tall man with the knife stepped forward, his eyes hard. "Get back, Linda. Don't be foolish." His words cut through the air like a blade. Rex's ears flattened against his head, and his lips curled into a silent snarl. He wasn't about to let anyone get any closer to the baby. The woman's face hardened as she stepped back, torn between the man's orders and the realization that their desperation was showing. She had come to understand that they had no other choice. This was survival, plain and simple, and Rex wasn't about to give them a chance. Rex didn't wait. His body surged forward in a blur of motion. His instincts told him to attack before they had a chance to strike. The first swing came from the tall man with the knife, and it came fast, aimed at Rex's throat. But Rex was already moving. He ducked, sidestepping with the grace of a predator. The knife missed by inches, and Rex took the opportunity to close the distance. His jaws snapped around the man's wrist with a sickening crunch, the metal of the knife falling uselessly to the ground. The man let out a strangled scream, and Rex tossed him aside, watching as he crumpled to the ground, clutching his injured arm. The other attackers froze, momentarily stunned by the speed and ferocity of the attack. But then, the woman with the club moved forward, raising her weapon with shaky hands. Her eyes were wide with terror, but there was no turning back. She swung the crude club toward Rex's head. Rex ducked again, his movements fluid and instinctive. He leapt forward, knocking the woman off balance, and before she could react, he sank his teeth into her leg. A sharp cry escaped her lips as she collapsed, writhing in pain. The remaining attackers hesitated, fear taking root in their hearts. They had never faced a creature like this, not like Rex. His eyes burned with an intensity that made even the bravest falter. With one more decisive move, Rex charged forward, tackling another of the men to the ground. The sound of his body hitting the earth was like thunder. The man didn't even have time to react before Rex's teeth were in his throat, tearing through flesh and bone in a flash of violent motion. It was a brutal fight, a fight that Rex had no choice but to win. As the last of the attackers retreated into the shadows, Rex stood panting, blood dripping from his muzzle. His body ached, his fur matted with dirt and sweat, but he couldn't afford to rest. Not yet. He turned to look at the baby. The child was still asleep, oblivious to the chaos that had just unfolded. Rex's heart swelled with pride in something else, something more tender. He had done what he had promised. He had protected this little one. But the war wasn't over. The danger was still out there, lurking in the dark. The aftermath of the fight was eerily silent. The forest, once alive with the sounds of animals and the breeze, now felt like a graveyard. The wind had stopped. The only sound was Rex's heavy breathing, the rise and fall of his chest. He stood motionless for a moment, surveying the scene. The attackers were gone, but Rex knew they wouldn't stay gone for long. He turned back to the baby, his heart aching with the weight of his promise. He lowered his head, sniffing at the small bundle that had become the center of his world. The baby was safe, for now. But Rex deep down that the threat wasn't over. There was a whole world out there that would never stop hunting. It was a world Rex had been running from for years, a world where survival meant fighting, meant killing. He growled low under his breath, not out of anger, but out of necessity. The fight for the baby's life had just begun. The morning sun crept into the forest, painting the dense greenery with a golden hue. Birds chirped in the distance, their melodies adding life to the otherwise quiet wilderness. For Rex, the once mighty fighting dog, the rising sun marked another sleepless night. He lay curled around the baby, his scarred and rugged body serving as a protective shield against the chill of the dawn. The infant stirred faintly in its makeshift cocoon of tattered blankets and Rex's warm fur. The baby's soft whimpering stirred Rex from his vigil. He nudged the child gently with his nose, eliciting a weak gurgle in response. The child was growing weaker. Its shallow breaths and the faint cries were a stark reminder that time was running out. Rex didn't understand the intricacies of human fragility, but his instincts told him the baby needed help, and soon. In the distance, faint human voices broke the silence. Rex's ears twitched, his muscles coiling like springs as he listened intently. The sounds grew louder, footsteps crunching through the underbrush, and voices calling out in measured urgency. "Search the perimeter. The family reported hearing cries last night," one voice commanded. Rex's body tensed. His history with humans was a mosaic of betrayal and violence, and his instincts screamed to retreat deeper into the forest. Yet a single glance at the frail infant reminded him that this time running wasn't an option. The voices drew closer until a group of forest rangers emerged into the clearing. The sight of a large, scarred dog crouched protectively over a baby froze them in their tracks. "Over here! I found them!" a young ranger called, his voice filled with disbelief. Rex growled low in his throat, his lips curling back to reveal jagged teeth. Though exhausted and battered, he placed himself firmly between the rangers and the baby. His amber eyes locked onto theirs, a silent warning not to come any closer. "Easy, boy," another ranger said softly, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. His voice was calm but edged with respect for the formidable animal before him. The youngest ranger noticed the baby wrapped in the blanket. "It's a baby," he exclaimed, his voice tinged with urgency. "We need to get it out of here. It looks weak." The lead ranger stepped forward cautiously. He knelt, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "We're here to help," he said, addressing Rex directly. "The baby's in trouble, and so are you." Rex didn't move, his growl still rumbling like distant thunder. The rangers could see the scars crisscrossing his body, a testament to a life of pain and survival. Yet it was his eyes, burning with both defiance and desperation, that told the real story. The lead ranger reached into his bag and pulled out a small strip of dried meat, holding it out as a peace offering. The scent wafted through the air, but Rex didn't flinch. His focus remained on the baby, as if daring the humans to make a move. The infant let out a weak, pitiful cry, breaking the standoff. Rex turned his head toward the baby, his growling softening. That brief moment of vulnerability was all the rangers needed. Moving swiftly but gently, they surrounded the scene. "We've got you both," the lead ranger murmured as he wrapped the baby in a fresh, warm blanket. Rex watched intently as the baby was lifted from the ground. He growled again, softer this time, then stood and followed the group as they carried the child toward their vehicle. Inside the ranger's truck, the baby was cradled in the arms of the youngest ranger, who checked its vitals and murmured words of comfort. Rex sat on the floor of the truck's cab, his head low but his eyes never leaving the infant. One of the rangers glanced back nervously. "Are we sure it's safe to bring that dog along?" The lead ranger nodded. "Look at him. He's not going anywhere without the baby. Besides, if he wanted to hurt us, he would have tried by now." The truck rumbled to life, and the group sped down the forest trail toward the nearest hospital. Rex shifted uneasily as the vehicle jolted over bumps and potholes, but he stayed close to the baby, his presence a constant, silent promise of protection. The hospital's emergency room was a flurry of activity as doctors and nurses swarmed around the baby. Rex, restrained by a makeshift leash fashioned from a ranger's belt, growled softly at anyone who came too close to him without the baby in sight. "He's attached to the child," one nurse whispered, eyeing the dog warily. "We'll keep him outside," the lead ranger said, though his voice carried an undertone of doubt. "But don't separate them for long. He might lose it." The baby was whisked away to the pediatric unit for immediate care. Rex paced anxiously in the waiting room, his claws clicking on the tiled floor. The rangers tried to calm him, but nothing seemed to work. Finally, one nurse brought a blanket that carried the baby's scent. Rex sniffed it and settled down reluctantly, though his eyes never left the doors that led to the pediatric wing. Hours passed. Finally, a doctor emerged, his face lined with exhaustion but lit with a smile. "The baby's stable," he announced. "Malnourished and dehydrated, but no permanent damage. You found them just in time." The rangers breathed a collective sigh of relief, but their attention quickly shifted to Rex, who was now staring at the doctor with intense focus. "And the dog?" one ranger asked. The doctor glanced at Rex and then back at the group. He's malnourished too, and those scars, it's clear he's been through a lot. But physically, he's strong. He's protective of the baby, isn't he? You have no idea, the lead ranger replied with a small smile. Later that evening, a young couple arrived at the hospital, their faces pale and drawn with worry. They had reported their baby missing after their car had been stolen in the night, the infant still inside. When they saw their child in the hospital crib, healthy and alive, tears streamed down their faces. They held the baby close, whispering words of love and relief. The mother looked up and noticed Rex sitting quietly in the corner, his eyes fixed on the reunion. "Is that the dog that saved her?" she asked, her voice trembling. The lead ranger nodded. "He found the baby in the forest and kept her safe until we got there. He's the reason your child is alive." The father approached Rex cautiously. The dog tensed, his gaze flicking to the baby. But when the infant cooed softly, safe in her parents' arms, Rex relaxed. The man knelt down and extended a hand. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Rex sniffed the man's hand, his tail giving a tentative wag. The couple decided almost immediately that Rex couldn't be left behind. "He's a hero," the father said. "He deserves a family too." The adoption process was quick, facilitated by the rangers and the hospital staff. For the first time in his life, Rex was no longer alone. He was no longer a discarded tool or a wandering survivor. He was part of a family. That night, as the baby slept peacefully in her crib, Rex lay on a soft bed in the corner of the room, his eyes half closed but still watchful. The warmth of the home, the soft murmur of the baby's breathing, and the gentle strokes of the mother's hand on his fur. All of it was new, strange, and wonderful. For the first time in years, Rex felt safe. He had found a purpose, a family, and a home. And as he drifted off to sleep, he knew one thing for certain. His days of fighting were over, but his days of protecting had just begun. Hope you enjoyed the story. If you want part 2 of this story, let me know in comment section.